Now, one asks the question, what happens to the right hemisphere? What does the right hemisphere do in the context of the left hemisphere being involved in language? Well, there are two interesting things that have emerged in subsequent years as a result of study of that. One is that there are homologous areas in the other hemisphere, and they're concerned with language, with aspects of language that are specialized in the emotional expression of language. So when somebody speaks to you and says, "Good morning, this is a wonderful day," you hear it in one way than if you were to say, "Good morning, this is a wonderful day." So there are aspects of your brain that perceive the emotional intonation, and those areas that perceive it are located on the right side in the equivalent area of Wernicke's area. They're concerned with what is called prosody, the sing-song quality of language, that aspect of language that we use for communicating how we feel about the world, the emotional aspects of language.
Once that's done, once you have some idea, and it's not you have some idea, once the visual system has done its thing so that there is a representation that preserves certain properties, there are two major streams, big, huge cortical pathways. One that goes down here in the so-called inferior temporal lobe. See, the lobes are named after the bones, so your temple. There's a lobe right under that. That's the temporal lobe. And the inferior part is the bottom part. That part of the brain is involved in recognizing shapes. If you get brain damage there, you may develop a syndrome called agnosia, where you're not blind, but you can't recognize anything. You can tell if two things are the same or different, but you can't say what they are. You can't mimic appropriately. You just don't know. The visual memories are stored down here. So if the input is disconnected by a lesion from the visual memories, you will be mind blind, as it has been called. But we don't run around hallucinating all the time. We don't always mistake our images for objects. In fact, it's fairly rare. Why is that? Well, images differ from percepts in a number of crucial ways. For one thing, images are very short-lived. If you think about the back of the brain here and what it does in perception and what it doesn't do, well, one thing it doesn't do is as you move your eyes around, you don't get smearing. Okay? It's likely that the neural patterns of activation don't linger very long every time you move your eyes. So that's good for perception, but if we're using the same machinery for imagery, it implies that images are often going to be like a flash. If I ask you a question, it's going to flash up and then fade. So in perception, you've got the world out there. That's sort of your memory for you. You can always look back to what you looked at. It's driving the system from outside. In imagery, you've got memory information driving the system. And that takes effort, and images fade quickly. So that's one big difference. The images tend to fade, whereas in the world, you've got the stuff out there driving it. Another difference is that I might want something to be present or absent in the world, but that's not going to make it so. But in images, I have control over that. In fact, I could even transform things. So I can do things like the following. Imagine the uppercase letter N. Okay? If you imagine it rotating 90 degrees clockwise, is it another letter? I can move things around like that in my image. I can't do that kind of thing in the world. Third, images tend to be less vivid. They tend to be less sharp. The edges seem to be dimmer, and there's much wider individual differences. Some people barely get any imagery at all. Some don't get any imagery at all, maybe 2%, if that. Even people who have very good imagery report that objects in their images are not quite as sharp or vivid as they see them normally. Now, some people with drugs report that they are as sharp under certain drugs. I'm talking about normal imagery. So differences like that allow us to tell whether we have an image or whether we have a percept, but it's not always so clear, which makes sense if the two really are very similar and drawing in the same system.
Now, one asks the question, what happens to the right hemisphere? What does the right hemisphere do in the context of the left hemisphere being involved in language? Well, there are two interesting things that have emerged in subsequent years as a result of study of that. One is that there are homologous areas in the other hemisphere, and they're concerned with language, with aspects of language that are specialized in the emotional expression of language. So when somebody speaks to you and says, "Good morning, this is a wonderful day," you hear it in one way than if you were to say, "Good morning, this is a wonderful day." So there are aspects of your brain that perceive the emotional intonation, and those areas that perceive it are located on the right side in the equivalent area of Wernicke's area. They're concerned with what is called prosody, the sing-song quality of language, that aspect of language that we use for communicating how we feel about the world, the emotional aspects of language.
Now, is there any compelling reason to believe that the system is closed? The answer is yes. The compelling reason is dreaming. Now, I dream in full color with great detail. If I say, how is it that I recognize my friend Francis Crick in my dreams, and then when he speaks with an English accent, and he's very critical. Why is all of that happening inside my head, although there is no sensory input? How can I see him? How can I hear his voice? Well, the only way that can happen is if the system is in fact sufficiently active as a closed system to be able to make an image in the absence of outside information. From that, something rather surprising can be thought through as a corollary, which is that the brain is basically for dreaming, and that you dream in two ways. When you are asleep, your eyes are closed in the dark, you have cognition that depends on whatever is in your memory and whatever the system can cook up. And when you're awake, you are in a dream state that is ruled by the senses. In other words, we have to redefine dreaming, because dreaming is the intrinsic functional event that generates the images into which we move when we walk or when we interact with the external world. It is a reality emulator, and the reality that we make can be either coming from the inside or it can be coming from the outside.
I like to think about this pattern that you see here as being related to one of the phenomena that Jean Piaget spent so much time in his career describing. And that was the phenomenon of stage transitions from a stage of development where the mind seems to think in one particular kind of a way to another stage where it thinks in a very different way. Piaget characterized these kinds of stages in many, many different domains. And one of the striking things about the idea of stages was that there were these long plateaus where nothing seemed to change, punctuated by very abrupt transitions to the next stage. That was very puzzling to many developmental psychologists, because on the one hand, they wanted to believe that experience was influencing development. On the other hand, it would seem, and it seemed to most everyone, that if experience was influencing development, there should be some way of seeing that all along at every step. What we can see in these kinds of models is that the nonlinearity of the way they operate allows us to understand how the effects of experience can actually be accumulating behind the scenes, as it were, during a particular stage of development, and thereby allowing the person or the individual to ultimately reach the point where they are ready to make a very rapid and abrupt change.
Now, this finding is really quite profound, because it has ramifications for everyday life. you remember I began by telling you that in the 1860s, when found, there is a body representation for all the muscles. There also is a representation of the body surface for tactile sensations. So for all the receptors that innervate the hand, the arm, the body surface. We thought until quite recently that the maps that we have in our brain of our body surface, of the skin, of the retina, of the muscles, are fixed, that you're born with them and you carry them throughout life. We now realize that this is not so, that they are dynamic, that as you play the piano and you practice, the representation of the hand area is expanding at the expense of other areas in the brain. This is something that Mike Mersnick showed, and it's really quite beautiful. So he examined the hand area of monkeys, and he found that if you look at different monkeys, they have different types of representation, size of representation of the hand. And he didn't know whether this is due to the fact that there were genetic differences between the monkeys, or whether the monkeys had different tactile experience. So he had the monkeys work a bar for food for many, many days, and he found that the 3 fingers that were used to press the bar expanded greatly at the expense of other areas of the brain.